Good afternoon, KCA listeners, and good afternoon and good evening to those listening to us on the live stream link. This is the Kathleen Wells Show. I'm Kathleen, and we are in a new year. This is my first show in the new year, and I'm delighted. I'm delighted to talk about something that I'm passionate about. For this first show in the new year, I'm going to talk about something that I'm passionate about. In fact, those who have listened to my show before know what I'm passionate about because I talk about it quite frequently. What is that? Mass incarceration and the drug war. And why am I passionate about mass incarceration? Why am I passionate about the drug war, the failed drug war? Something we've been immersed in for the last 30 years or so. Well, I'm passionate about it because I'm concerned about justice. I'm concerned about equal protection under the law. I'm concerned about the inequities in our society. And I'm concerned about my community, the Black community. So this is because the drug war, mass incarceration, has disproportionately adversely infected my community. So I'm going to talk about it. And I've talked about it with judges on this show and with police chiefs, and I've talked about it with lawyers on this show. And today, guess what? I'm going to talk about it with a neuroscientist. I mean, doesn't that sound heady? And I mean, he's just going to take the lid off of it. He's just going to seal it for us and make it certain. But before I bring him on, his name is Dr. Carl Hart. Before I bring on Dr. Hart, let me tell you a few things about him. He is the first tenured Black professor in the sciences at Columbia University, where he is an associate professor in psychology, in the psychology and psychiatry departments. Dr. Hart is also a member of the National Advisory Council on Drug Abuse and a research scientist in the Division of Substance Abuse at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. However, long before Dr. Hart entered the hallowed halls of the Ivy League, Dr. Hart gained firsthand knowledge about drug usage while growing up in one of Miami's toughest neighborhoods. His memoir is titled High Price, A Neuroscientist's Journey of Self-Discovery that challenges everything you know about drugs and society. In this book, Dr. Hart recalls his journey of self-discovery, how he escaped a life of crime and drugs and avoided becoming one of the crack addicts he now studies. So, welcome to the Kathleen Wells Show, Dr. Hart.
Thank you for having me, Kathleen.
Well, I'm delighted to have you, and I feel like you've sort of blown the lid off of the drug war. You've given us science, and you've exposed the myths and why the drug war has been a failure. So let's start with your book, High Price. In that book, you say it's a hybrid, and you've divided it into 3 parts: part memoir, part big science book, and part policy book. Tell us, why did you make those divisions?
Well, one of the things that you mentioned is that the science now shows us that much of what we're doing related to the war on drugs is probably incorrect. The science has been there for many years, but the problem is much of the science literature, or when you read the science literature, many people find it boring, and so they don't really stay plugged in. So I thought it would be interesting to combine an engaging narrative. So I used my life story with the science literature. And once you do that, you come to the conclusion that what we're doing is wrong. And if what we're doing is wrong, you need to make some suggestions. And so that's the policy portion of the book.
And, I posted your appearance on my show. Whenever I have a show, I post it on my Facebook page. And one of the things that someone said is, gosh, he's such a smart guy. He's a genius. Oh, my God. And one of the things that I got from your book, I haven't read it fully yet, but I've gotten some aspects of it, is that the broader community, or America, or the white community, doesn't realize that there are smart people in the Black community. I mean, it's like they think the media has criminalized Black men, has criminalized, or I don't know if the word is criminalized that I want to use, but they think that, when you're smart, you're like an exception. And I know you study brain science. I don't know if brain science means you know what IQs are, but do you speak about this fact that, you have the same amount of smart people in each group? Do you get what I'm getting at? It's
yeah,
not.
No, you raise an important issue because, I have 3 black sons myself, and I certainly worry about how America sees them. And, on the one hand, this is an American problem because when we look throughout our media, our television, you just look at any industry in America, you just see an absence of black men. And so when you have this sort of void, this absence of people, it's easy to make up a narrative that, well, these people are not qualified, they're not competent enough to be here, so therefore they're not smart enough. And that connects to what we're talking about today, this war on drugs. This war on drugs, in effect, has systematically eradicated or removed all of these black men and therefore removed their sort of opportunity or potential to be contributors in the larger society. So they're not there, they're in jail, they must be criminal. That's the sort of simplistic thinking that goes on in the country.
It's simplistic thinking. And as I mentioned, I have police chiefs on the show, I have judges on the show, and there has been a concerted effort to deliberately go inside certain communities, the black community, the brown communities, and criminalize these young men. It's not like, and this is something I discussed with Michelle Alexander, her book, Mass Incarceration, The New Jim Crow. It's not like blacks use drugs any more than whites.
Yeah, well, you don't need to have individuals do this intentionally. So one of the things I want to make clear is that in New York City, for example, we have a police force that's pretty diverse. However, most of the people who are arrested for many of the drug-related crimes and other crimes are black. And so black people certainly aren't saying, the black police officers certainly aren't saying, hey, let's go arrest these black folks. That's not what they're saying, but there's a system in place such that where do you put most of your law enforcement resources? In black communities. If you do that, you're going to get some results. And those results are higher incarceration or arrest rates for black people. So these sort of systemic sort of things that happen in police forces, the same sort of things happen even in Ivy League institutions, in media outlets. Who do you interview for the job? You interview friends of the people who have jobs. And so it decreases the likelihood of you having black people participate. So this is a systemic American problem, one that we haven't really talked about in any sort of honest, candid way. I mean, we talk about it still in terms of the 1960s, 50s, and 40s, like the Klan. Who is the person who used the N-word? They're a bad person. That is so remedial. You don't need to use the N-word to behave in ways that are racist.
Yeah, well, we try to talk honestly on my show, and I've had Police Chief of Seattle, Norm Stamper, on this show. He's the chief of police. He was for 20 years. And he says, yes, they do say, let's go arrest these black folks. It is deliberate. It is intentional. Because...
Can you imagine somebody saying, let's go arrest these black folks in the presence of other black people? I mean, that might be an aberration, but I don't think that's happening on a wide scale. I think something far more insidious is happening. I mean, certainly in my institution, I know there aren't white people sitting around saying that, hey, we're only going to hire white people. But that's all we have. Well, that's the main sort of folks we have here. But you don't need people to say it out blatantly, because when you do that, that's a lot easier to deal with than what's currently going on in much of the country. For example, we have a black president, but yet we have black males make up 6% of the general population and 35% of the prison population. And we have a black president and a black attorney general. And I don't think either one of those guys would say, yeah, let's arrest black guys.
Right. So it's not explicitly stated. It's not, but it's this implicit assumption that is taking place. For instance, that we saw this in the Trayvon Martin trial, where you have an implicit racial bias. In other words, what I'm thinking is that they're not explicitly saying, yes, let's go arrest these black folks, but they're saying, but implicitly they know if we want to find crack cocaine or people with drugs, we can find it in the black community.
Sure, that's right. That's where you place your law enforcement resources. Absolutely.
And they get well, no, you know what I want to touch on now is something that Michelle Alexander talks about in her book, Mass Incarceration, the New Jim Crow, that the drug war, which started a little more than 30 years ago, was a reaction to the gains that were made in the black community from the civil rights movement. It's like, let's criminalize these folks because they have made gains due to the civil rights movement. So now let's figure out a different way to deal with these people who have made gains. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, Michelle Alexander, she has written and spoken beautifully on that topic. It was actually about 40 years ago. And the thing is that, yeah, the Nixon administration, they called it the Southern Strategy. They used these coded words, so they didn't have to use race or black or any of those sorts of things. Instead, they associated crime and drugs with black people. But the thing that we're in 2014, and the thing that people have to realize today, we have a black president. We've had many black mayors. We had black people who are involved with the current administrations. And so the thing that I wrote about was that black people have been complicit in this sort of mass incarceration of other black people. Of course, white folks have played a dominant role, but we need to understand how this happened and how it happens today. So when we think about drugs, people say, well, drugs are destroying the community. Black people, white folks, a number of people have said those sorts of things. But when you look at things more carefully, you see that it's not the drugs, because drugs are being used, more drugs are being used in white communities. And no one is saying that the white community is being destroyed by drugs. They're only saying it in like black communities. And so when you think about the fact that most of the people who use drugs are white and most of the drug users do so without a problem, it tells you that the problem is not drugs. The problem is the drug policy and how we enforce the drug policy. We enforce these drug policies selectively. The Attorney General, Eric Holder, has even said that he now even recognizes that our enforcement of drug laws has been racist. He's even said it. That's the problem. And we need to make sure that the community takes away the sort of juice behind the enforcement of these laws by understanding that it's not crack that brought your community down. It was poverty, unemployment, uneducation, the government disinvesting in programs that were safety nets like welfare. That's where the problem are. And so people need to understand that.
Mm-hmm. So you're a neuropsychopharmacologist. That's a long word. A neuropsychopharmacologist. Talk to me, Dr. Hart, about the science. What do you know, and tell us?
So what I do is I actually study the effects of drugs on people. And I have been doing this for about 20 years now. And when I first started, I thought drugs like crack cocaine were so addictive that if you gave one hit, you would be addicted to the drug. I believed that when I initially started. And so I was trying to figure out what are the brain mechanisms that made people addicted to this drug. And so I went about my career trying to figure that out. Turns out the drug is not as addictive as people said it was. In fact, only about 15% of the people who smoke crack cocaine are addicted. And that means 85%, 80% are not addicted. And so that was a revelation when I found this out during my research. I also found out that you can change an addict's sort of choice to take crack cocaine if you provide alternatives that are attractive. Not only did we learn this from the working with humans in the laboratory, we also learned this from animals. Same is true with animals. When animals learn how to take a drug intravenously by pressing a lever, they will press for that lever for cocaine, for example. But if you provide alternatives like a sexually receptive mate, some sweet treat, or running wheel, the animal will no longer find the drug as attractive. And so all of these kinds of things just started to blow my mind. And that I realized that I had been misled. These drugs are not as addictive as I once thought they were. And if that's the case, what is really going on here?
Mm-hmm. And what is really going on?
Well, what's really going on is that if you stop blaming drugs, drugs are an excellent scapegoat. So if you no longer have that scapegoat, that means that you might actually have to, talk about the unemployment rate.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
In this country, black people have always been twice is more likely to be unemployed than white folks. Why is that if we're not a country that's not racist? Why is that if folks are equally qualified? You got to actually deal with that question if you no longer have drugs as a scapegoat. You also have to deal with the issue of education in these communities. You have to deal with the issue of, hey, we might have to provide some safety nets for folks. So in case folks are unemployed, we want to make sure that their children are not living in poverty. But if you have drugs to blame, you can say it's their own fault because they're using those drugs, and drugs will destroy you.
And so this goes back to what I was discussing earlier about the intellect, the ability to think, the ability to be intelligent. Most people, whether they're black or white or brown or pink or orange, are average in their ability to think, their intellectual ability. They're average, right?
Yeah, most of us are. I mean, the thing is that you want people to work hard and have the opportunity, first of all, to work hard, and then you get better at whatever skill you're trying to work on.
And so those who are being criminalized and massively imprisoned are not having access to resources and opportunities so that they have alternatives other than drugs. Would you agree with that?
And that's certainly some of what's going on in the prisons. I mean, and there are other things that are going on. Like, for example, there are people who actually are addicted to drugs. You know, there's a smaller percentage, and they might be addicted for a variety of reasons, including having other psychiatric disorders that drives their addiction. So the point is that if we realize that drugs aren't the problem, it allows us to really get at the problem that people actually face.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, we're going to take a break, but before we go to the break, I want to give out the call-in number so that folks who are listening may, if they want to call in, they can call in and ask Dr. Hart a question. That call-out number is 1-888-909-1050. So if you have a question for Dr. Hart, please call in at 888-909-1050. And when we come back from the break, I don't hear the music yet. I guess I'll hear it eventually. But when we come back from the break, Dr. Hart, I want us to talk about, I want you to discuss with KCA listeners the difference between the sentencing penalties between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. Why were those distinctions made with sentencings when there's no difference in the two drugs, crack and powder cocaine? And then also I'd like us to discuss the remedy. How can we make things better? So we're going to take a break and we'll be right back. Hi. Difficulties there for a second. I wasn't sure what was going on. But anyway, we're back on air. Thank you. I'm so grateful to be back on air with my guest, Dr. Carl Hart, who is a neuroscientist. Actually, it's a longer word than that. Let me look at, I have it here for a second. What is it? Neuropsycho, wait, I haven't gotten it yet. It's like, yeah, it's a long word. A neuropsychopharmacologist. I love that word. That's a new word for me. Okay? So anyway, Dr. Hart, I want to ask you a question. You know what I did before I brought you on? I looked at many, not all, but many of the interviews that you did. You interviewed with Amy Goodman with Democracy Now! And Tavis Smiley. And you were even on C-SPAN. You interviewed with Google. And guess who else? Bill O'Reilly. Can you imagine? What I want to ask you is, what did you learn in all those interviews? What did you get from that, and what did you learn?
I'm learning quite a bit. This is the beautiful thing about life. I'm trying to be a sponge, so I'm constantly learning. I guess the major thing that I learned is that network TV is not interested in any thoughtful or critical information. That's not their role. Their role is to entertain and keep people mindless. And so, like, when we think about the interviews where I thought that we had an exchange of something other than ignorance, some real good information, Tavis Smiley did an outstanding job. Amy Goodman, she did an outstanding job. I love talking to Bill Maher. It's just unfortunate in the format of his show, we didn't get enough time, but I think he is super smart and well-read, thoughtful, and very serious despite what people may think of him. So it's been quite a lesson.
Well, so tell us about your experience on Fox with Bill O'Reilly.
Bill O'Reilly was fun. I think that I think that Bill O'Reilly realizes. I mean, he's had the #1 show. I think now for 17 years, maybe. Uh-huh. It's the #1 news show, and so it's #1 because of his ability to entertain. And I don't think he's going to change. So I don't know if the goal of that show is to disseminate accurate, good information. I don't think that's the first goal. Certainly not by the content. And so people who don't like the show, I think that they want factual information. They want something a little different than just a dissemination of ignorance. So, but I had a great fun with him. I knew what it was, and I took it for what it was, and I enjoyed it.
Well, you're very diplomatic. I remember he asked you on the show, is texting addictive? Is texting. He was suggesting that teenagers are now getting addicted to texting. I mean, there's no response to that, huh?
Well, he has to put on a show every day. And so sometimes you have to stretch. I think that's what was going on there.
Okay. Well, talk to me about brain science. What is brain science, and what do we learn from brain science?
Well, when we think about drugs, my area, I can speak more, I guess, with more authority in that area. Brain science, we have to think about it at multiple levels, because there is brain science that's being conducted in laboratory animals, in rats, for example. And we can learn quite a bit about how the brain works or function, or the neurochemicals in the brain work and function after a drug, by studying the brains of rats. And we can have a pretty good understanding about those neurochemicals in humans by studying rats. So a lot of information has been generated, and I've learned a lot. We've learned a lot. Now, as we think about brain imaging in humans and as it relates to drug abuse, one of the things that concerns me, this is one of my greatest concerns, is that we have in recent years overstated what those pretty pictures mean. For example, it is not uncommon for some researchers to put up a picture of someone who they say is a cocaine addict, and then they'll put up a brain image of somebody who never used drugs. And then they'll have one of these brains lit up a little more than the other, and then they will make these wild statements about what that means for how that person behaves. When in fact, that tells you nothing about the person's behavior, nothing, absolutely nothing. And so when it's used like that, that's more like voodoo. And that's bad science. And there's a lot of that going around. And I've written in the book, in High Price, in one chapter, how the public can evaluate good science from bad science.
Tell us how they can differentiate good science from bad science. Yeah.
Columbia students pay about $40,000 a year for that information. That is really a course. I mean, it's not as simple as me telling people this. It's like you said, it's brain science. It's kind of complicated. But what I'm telling you now, one of the things that people can understand quickly is that when they see a picture, an image of somebody's brain, and some person, a researcher is telling them, this means that person behaves like this, a red flag should go up if that scientist does not have any data about how that person is behaving.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So 20 plus million Americans use drugs over time, and people will always use drugs. That's what we've learned throughout time. People will always use drugs. Yet despite that reality, drugs have had an adverse impact on race and on our culture, because it's based on a distorted perception rather than on facts. It's based on anecdotes and on fears rather than on facts. Is that accurate? Am I stating it correctly, or can you state it better for me?
Yeah, so it's not the drugs that have had the adverse effects. It's the drug policies and our beliefs about drugs and how we have dealt with drugs in our society. So, like you pointed out, there are 20 million current users of illicit drugs in this country. Every society has had psychoactive drug use. Every society will continue to have psychoactive drug use. Those are facts. Once you understand that there is no such thing as a drug-free America or a drug-free workplace or a drug-free anything, once you understand that fact, now you can deal with these things in a rational way. But our country got hoodwinked into believing that there's such a thing as a drug-free society. Quite frankly, you don't want to live in a drug-free society. Drugs have beneficial effects and they have potentially harmful effects. If we were smart, and we are smart enough, we have enough smart people, and we have the data evidence, we can teach people how to decrease the harmful effects of drugs and enhance the positive effects. And we haven't done that. We've done that in other sort of potential dangerous activities like driving an automobile. In the 1960s, for example, accidents were relatively high. Today, they are relatively low, car accidents. We instituted some measures to help keep our society safe. We instituted speed limits, seat belts, airbags, a variety of measures to decrease the harms associated with driving. We can do the same thing with drugs. But as I said, drugs are just so ideal as scapegoats. Politicians love this drug issue. Law enforcement's budgets are increased because of this drug issue. Parents are allowed to be stupid and not teach their children. So even parents love this drug issue. So there are a number of constituents in our society who benefits from keeping people ignorant about drugs.
And in fact, prisons are now being privatized. And one of the conditions of privatized prisons is that they must remain full. I think some jurisdictions say, yes, we must keep our prisons as full as 90%. And then in fact, over the last 30 years, our prisons have increased due to the drug offenses. The major increase, how can I say, the explosion of our in prison has been over the last 30 years due to drug offenses, arresting people who are using drugs. That's why our prisons. So if we're building more prisons instead of more schools, and they're private prisons, we're going to just continue down this path.
Yes.
Of imprisoning, people.
Absolutely. No, you hit it on the head. Prisons, the private prison industry, they all are fighting to keep the drug laws the way they are so they can continue to arrest people for these infractions that are not as they have been made out to be. So you're absolutely right.
So you're all about educating people. So tell me, what can KCA listeners to the Kathleen Wells Show, what can they do to make things better, to shift the winds, to shift the change, the direction in which we're headed?
Yeah, number one, the first thing they can do is please get the book High Price. In that book, there is quite a bit of education in terms of how you decrease some of the harmful effects associated with drugs. For example, when we think about heroin, a number of people think that heroin overdose is very likely. While it is possible to die from heroin alone, it is rare. Of the heroin-related deaths, 75% of them occur because people combine heroin with another sedative, usually alcohol. So the public health message should be loud and clear. If you're going to use heroin or any other opioid, OxyContin, you name it, do not combine it with alcohol. That's one sort of just important fact that we as a public has failed to get out and make clear. Another important message is you're in California. I understand that methamphetamine is a drug that a number of people take out there. Methamphetamine, the major concern with methamphetamine is that people are not sleeping when you take stimulants. We all know this. So you want to make sure that methamphetamine users or any other stimulant users understand, don't take the drug near bedtime. And if you're using the drug, make sure you're getting the proper amount of sleep, because sleep disruptions can cause all kinds of physical ailments as well as psychological ailments. And so those problems are larger than the drug problems themselves in general. Drug like marijuana, relatively new users, make sure that these folks are not taking large amounts, particularly in their early stages of using the drug, because it increases the likelihood of having panic attack, anxiety attacks, all of these things that seem awful and can be awful for the person who is experiencing them. So we do a fair amount of education with alcohol in our commercials, in movies. It is socially unacceptable, for example, to wake up in the morning and have a drink. That's taboo in our society, and we've done that through basic public education. We can do a similar sort of thing with these other drugs. Alcohol is one of the most potentially dangerous drugs known to humans, and we use it safely because we have a vast amount of education.
Well, every now and then I have had a Bloody Mary in the morning. So that was supposed to be funny. You didn't laugh.
No. I was going to say, I'm sorry. I was going to say that's okay, because we none of us live by logic alone. So that's okay.
That's okay. Okay, so I know you're for decriminalization as opposed to legalizing drugs. Tell us why.
Well, I have. First of all, I want to say the people of Colorado and Washington, they've recently legalized marijuana, and my hat's off to them. They've taken matters into their own hands. It's be a nice experiment. The thing is, the reason why I have argued that we should decriminalize everything is because of many of the issues that we are pointing out here, including some of these issues raised by Michelle Alexander, the sort of selective enforcement of drug laws targeting communities of color. That's one. Another reason is that we've overstated the harmful effects of drugs. We have exaggerated the harmful effects of drugs. We've lied to the public about the potential dangers of drugs. That's another. And it is costing the society in terms of human cost, in terms of monetary cost, you name it. It's in terms of lack of respect for our laws. All of these sorts of things is costing the society so dearly. All of these things are the reasons that I'm arguing that we decriminalize drugs. Decriminalization is not legalization. Legalization is more like alcohol and how we treat tobacco. Decriminalization would be treating drug violations, drug possession violations, like we treat traffic violations. Maybe you'll get a fine, but certainly you will not get criminal time. You will not get a criminal felony or a record as a result. You will not ruin your life chances of getting a job. And so I argue for decriminalization mainly because, rather than legalization, mainly because I think the American public is so ignorant about drug effects. We are susceptible to believing incredible things about drugs. And if you make drugs more widely available, they're like we're going to see in Colorado and Washington, there's going to be some incredible stories. They're not going to be true. They're going to be incredible stories attributed to the dangers of marijuana. Our kids now are smoking more marijuana. They're doing more poorly. They're engaging in all kinds of abhorrent behaviors. You're going to start seeing these stories. And some people will believe them. And so I'm arguing before we legalize drugs, we provide the public with the proper amount of education. And then once that is done, I'm okay with legalization. And so decriminalization for me can function as an intermediary step. But I think we need to really make sure we educate the public in a similar way we did with automobile safety.
But you know what? I don't know if the will is there. I remember when Ronald Reagan's wife, what was her name, Nancy, said, just say no to drugs. And then the media, the way they show all these commercials, oh, this is your brain on drugs, frying an egg, that kind of thing. And then remember when it was like, oh my God, crack cocaine. You would see all throughout the media and in newspapers, everywhere on TV, about how crack cocaine was so dangerous and you just take it once and you're hooked for life. You remember seeing, and then the politicians got in on that. Do you know what I mean? So where is the will? I think there's something fundamentally wrong with our system.
Well, I think, you point out some beautiful examples. But one of the things that you left out is that you're here now. You're on the air. There are other people out here. I'm trying to do this. I've written a book about these things. There are other people who are trying to keep the society honest, and we weren't around then. And so I am encouraged that there are people out here being more critical and thoughtful about this issue, because you are absolutely right. We lost our minds in the 80s with that stuff. You're absolutely right.
And I like the way you say we're trying to keep the society honest. There are a few of us that are trying to do that. But I feel like it's like Sisyphus. We're pushing a rock up the hill. Do you know that image? And it keeps rolling back down.
Yes.
The rock keeps going up and going. I mean, and that's regarding everything. Our war policy, just everything is just like a rock being pushed up the hill and then it's going. But you're optimistic? Are you optimistic?
I have to be, yeah. I mean, I'm talking to you. I mean, we're having this conversation over the airways. So, yes, I am optimistic, but you are absolutely right as well. Progress is not linear, and these battles have to be fought and refought. And that's okay. I accept that bargain too, and part of that bargain means that I have to do my part. And so do you, and you are. And so that's all we can do.
That's all we can do. That's all we can do. There's not more. I mean, I feel like I'm not doing enough. I feel like I need to do more. And I feel like things are just getting worse. It's like, since the recession, the Black community makes 18 times less in terms of wealth than the white community, and I try to talk, this matters to me. I want parity. I want equality. I want, equity in society.
Yes, I'm with you. And so when we think about your listeners and we think about the responsibility that we have as a society, we, for example, vote for certain people and we put people in office because we expect them to lobby on our behalf and have policies that will be reflective of our interests and concerns. And so that means that your listening audience has to put pressure on me, have to put pressure on their local politicians, their national politicians. If they don't put pressure on all of us, everyone, nothing's going to happen. So don't say to me that you like me, so therefore you're not going to say anything. I need you to tell me what your concerns are, just like you need to tell President Obama what your concerns are.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. We'll come back. I'm speaking with neuropsychopharmacologist Dr. Carl Hart. His book is High Price. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to find the answer. We'll be right back. I'm here with neuropsychopharmacologist, Dr. Carl Hart. You know what that song, Marvin Gaye, Trouble Man? In fact, your book was initially going to be titled Trouble Man. Tell us, why did you change it?
Well, I wanted it to be called Trouble Man, but the publishers, they do this more than me, and so they thought that Trouble Man was a bit outdated, and that if it was 1973, they were down, but since it was 2013, they were like, no. 40 years earlier, they would have been with it, but
so why do you call it High Price?
So High Price is a title that my PhD advisor came up with. High price is a nice sort of play on the price of getting high, and also the high price that I paid in order to be successful in this society. So it's a play on multiple sort of things. The high price that we pay as a society to control drugs, our drug policies, and that sort of thing.
And when you say the price that you paid in order to be successful in society, what do you mean by that?
Well, in the book, I talk a lot about my upbringing and where I came from. I grew up in the projects, the hood, poor sort of environment. And the people who were around me, my friends, many of those people, relatives, they were in jail or dead, and those kinds of things. And people oftentimes say that they're in jail or dead because of some shortcoming that they had, some personal failing. When in fact, these are some structural sort of things that our society has contributed to and have ignored. And so when I now know this as a thoughtful person, somebody who has studied these things, it causes me a lot of cognitive dissonance and sadness, and if I'm not careful, bitterness and anger. And, that's a hell of a price to pay when I'm looking around me in my Ivy League institution and I don't see other brothers who look like me or who came from where I came from. It does a number to you, it plays with your mind.
Oh, I can imagine. In fact, I did an internship when I was an undergrad at Columbia, and that's on the Upper West Side.
Yes.
And you rarely see us there. You know what I mean? So anyway, but this is interesting. And when you were on with John Stossel, and you have dreadlocks, and John Stossel said to you, "You look more like a drug dealer." Was that funny or what?
Yeah, I think he was trying to perform for his audience, and there were a number of people who emailed me, tweeted at me, and they were angry with him. But John Stossel, to his credit, he has emailed to me in support, particularly after being on the O'Reilly show and those things, and so I have to make sure I give him props too, because he certainly has been supportive.
Well, I mean, yes, exactly. You're very diplomatic and nice. You're a nice person. But the idea that a black man with dreadlocks is a drug dealer is absurd to me.
Yeah, I can say, I don't have much time on camera, but off camera, you can say like, yo, man, most of the drug dealers are white cats.
Hello, like Michael Douglas's son.
Well, there are a number of, white guys too. I mean, and not only that, the Drug Enforcement Agency and many of our sort of law enforcement people, they certainly know most of the drug dealers are white because many of them are informants and they're working for them and they know this.
Mm-hmm. And yet these perceptions permeate our society, that the media perpetrates these perceptions that are that are inaccurate, that are false notions, and they have impacted adversely your family, my community, these notions that are permeating in our society and in our media. Somebody has to take some responsibility as far as I'm concerned, don't you think?
Absolutely. I mean, like as you and I sit here and talk, we have a black president and we have the highest law enforcement official in the United States is a black man, Eric Holder. So all of these kinds of things, you want to make sure that the people who we supported and put in office are aware of our concerns in this domain. And so our listeners, your listeners, want to make sure that they send a message to their politicians, to the people who they support.
So ring your representatives, send emails to the White House. Is that what you suggest? Because
Absolutely.
I mean, there is a movement out there against the drug war, the failed drug war. Michelle Alexander is spearheading it, and yet Obama isn't saying anything.
Yeah, I think you want to be careful when you say Michelle Alexander is spearheading it. She is one of my favorite people, and I appreciate it. But understand that there have been people out here longer than her, and they've been fighting these battles. And so her book really kind of put all these issues together in a way that no one else did. But there are a number of people out here fighting for this end, and many of them educated her and educated me as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, so we have one more minute. What would you like to leave KCA listeners with? What thoughts, what ideas?
I just hope that whenever your listeners hear people attributing some bad behavior to a drug effect, I hope they're able to ask some simple questions. How do you know the person was on drugs? Do you know the person wasn't screwed up before they took the drug? Also, do you know that most of the people who use that drug doesn't have that problem? So how can you blame the drug? So I hope that these folks are critical when they hear drug-related information in the future.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hart, for being my guest. We were speaking with neuropsychopharmacologist Dr. Carl Hart. His book is High Price. I encourage everyone out there to go out there and get it and read it. Thank you for being my guest today.
Thank you, and have a good one.
And I'll have you on again. I haven't read your book, but I'll have you on again after I read it. How does that sound?
Sounds great to me.
Sounds good. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye, KCA listeners. See you next week.